There. And my name is Nayaswami Hriman. I'm here on Kameno Island, and we're going to share with you from Yogananda, Paramahansa Yogananda's original lessons. We're in the advanced course in practical metaphysics at this time, and we're going to do lesson 7, which he entitles Spiritual Marriage. But I've asked Yoganandaji to sing for us a chant. So let's listen.
There is a Bengali song. Khapare bhakti dite pari, mukti dite pari, bhakti dite pari koi. Khapare mukti dite pari, bhakti dite pari koi. O devotee, I can give thee salvation, but not my love and devotion. For when I give those away, I give myself away. Ask of me salvation, but not my love and devotion. For indeed, when I give those away, I become poor, walking on your heart's way. That's it.
It's not a chant you hear very often if you come to the various Ananda centers in person or online these days, but it's wonderful to hear him chant it, saying, I think he quotes Divine Mother in a different way somewhere else where he says, Divine Mother said to him, "To those to whom I give much, I do not give myself." In other words, those who have a comfortable life, a successful life, etc., the material satisfactions of earthly life, in other words, Divine Mother withholds her greater gifts of joy, wisdom, and so forth. So she can give us all these gifts, but to have her for yourself takes the love of your heart. So speaking of the love of our hearts, today's lesson on spiritual marriage is, I'll tell you right off the bat, a puzzler, especially these days and in the consciousness of our culture, particularly in America and the West generally, because it talks of the difference between male and female, between men and women. There's such a grassroots push on, in our culture especially, to transcend gender and what's it called? Gender? Well, anyway, and I think the spiritual purpose of that is precisely that, to be free and be liberated from the stereotypical expectations and behavior of human life based on gender, and even based on the gender of the physical body. So from the spiritual standpoint, there's a push on an awakening to transcend differences of all kinds, racial, religious, economic, and as well as gender differences. And I think this is a very good thing, at least from the spiritual point of view. It may have mixed results in other ways, but that's how I prefer to see it. So when Yogananda in 1926 wrote this lesson, he was really addressing it is today also the basic consciousness between, most people are quite aware of the difference between men and women, and for the most part delight in les différences, as it were. So notwithstanding the transgender movement, which is very nicely named from a metaphysical standpoint, that's not where most people are. It's a tiny minority. So what he says still finds great application in today. In the 1960s, in the hippie movement, when some of that transgender kind of idea that men and women are the same and we should treat each other as friends and equals was a very excellent part of that. It didn't last very long, but it was the right idea in my book. So he being Yogananda, goes to Genesis naturally, and he talks about, as he would as a great yogi, that these things, these differences that we see outwardly, have their origins inwardly. The kingdom of heaven, as Jesus said, is within you. And so he quotes Genesis 2:8 in saying, God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Eastward, he writes, refers to the point between the eyebrows where the sun of heavenly eye and wisdom is seen. And so our true nature is that of a point of singularity, as an astrophysicist studying black holes might put it. This point of singularity, beyond gender, beyond the differences, duality, lies here at the spiritual eye. The tree of life in the midst of the garden, mentioned in Genesis, refers to the spine and the tree of consciousness. The tree of consciousness in the astral spine, with each of the astral energy centers coming up the spine, relates to or expresses or gives the power to express different levels of consciousness: material consciousness, feeling, experience, willpower, love, deep calmness, wisdom. All these different things are attributes of consciousness, which in the tree of life, which gives us life, lies within us. And then he goes on to talk about how in Genesis God talks about man being alone and needing a helpmate. I find this all very confusing, and I'm going to try to resist my impulse to give my own opinions on these things. But in any case, if you want to consider the creation of the second gender as a help, that's up to you. But that's what he said. So, but see, Yogananda finishes that part by saying ideal marriage means liberation. But think about what he just said. Ideal marriage. Most marriage is not ideal, and it does not mean liberation. It means bondage. It starts with marriage between a pretty shade of lipstick, as Yogananda called it, and a handsome bow tie, meaning superficial. That's pretty much what we see nowadays. And so, does that help anybody? Well, given that that's how we are, yes, of course, we can turn the sow's ear of gender differences into the silk purse of liberation, certainly, and that's what this lesson is about, is how to relate to one another in a way that liberates us from the obvious delusion that one or the other is going to make us happy. Okay, and so he goes on in his classic Yogananda way that you find throughout his teachings to describe man, meaning the male, as one in whom reason is uppermost, to use his terms, and the female, the woman, as one for whom feeling is uppermost and reason is somewhat hidden. That's just an old-fashioned way of talking. I'm sorry, I just have to put it that way. Women are obviously just as intelligent and rational as men, and vice versa. But if you observe sensitively from his point of view these statements, I think you'll see the thread of truth that runs through it. But in any case, it's not the impulse of most of us to want to make fine distinctions. I mean, it can be a butt of jokes and, that sort of thing. And maybe at some point earlier in life when you're enthralled by the opposite sex, it might be good to study the differences and learn how to deal with it positively. But there also comes a point in life when you just want to put it behind you, and or the soul does anyway. So saying reason and feeling in that way has its place. I think where it really has its place, though, is within ourselves. He also said, in connection with reason and feeling being uppermost or hidden, male and female, is that reason follows feeling. And that is very, very helpful. If you see it when we are emotionally aroused, we find all the reasons to support what we want or how we feel. And when reason does not have the support of feeling, it's dry, it's stillborn, it has no motivation, no power to manifest. It's just another of a billion other little thoughts that go through one's mind. On a cosmic level, a metaphysical level that may not interest most of you, but always interests the likes of me, is that God, in order to create the world, creating the pairs of opposites, one of those pairs of opposites was the separation of perception from feeling. Consciousness, when it's united, is the coming together of the feeling nature and the reason nature, for which the symbol of man and woman being united is, on a metaphysical level, is the most powerful symbol. That it doesn't actually come to that on a practical human level is the story of creation. But in any case, I think for us by ourselves internally to understand that we use not our reason in the sense of logic, but our perception, our power to be mindful, to observe our own attitudes, feelings, emotions, and observe them in the cold light of day, can help unmask their self-interest, to unmask their basis in egoity and their basis in selfishness or emotional disturbance. That's the power of these things, is to unite. He uses the term reason, but it's consciousness. It's not just consciousness devoid of context. It's perception. It is the I am principle in observing objects or whatever it observes. Okay. So he talks about creating woman from the rib of Adam. I don't find much percentage in that nowadays, particularly. It just is what it is. He describes the rib as the vibration and so forth, but I don't know what value that I can make of that for myself or yourself. He talks about the Garden of Eden. The garden is the human body. The trees are the various nervous systems of the body, different senses. The fruit of these senses are the sensations we actually feel. And he says, when God says that you would die if you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he meant to die as to your consciousness of spirit, of the soul, your consciousness of non-duality, your consciousness of oneness with God. And so the subject of that tree of knowledge of good and evil is a huge subject, and not really sure what to say about that. Yogananda attributes the fall of man as described by Adam and Eve in the garden, whether in fact in time and space or whether in the real time of space of our own lives, such as when we reach puberty would be at least symbolic of this, but every day of our life, as our preferring to have it our way. And the whole issue, he attributes it to the memory in former and lower life forms, man and woman, of sexual reproduction, as opposed to the immaculate way of reproduction, which in a higher age is said to be possible, not just in heaven, but also in the higher age, in a golden age, where men and women could unite here at the spiritual eye. And just as Mary conceived Jesus without human sexuality, and the mother of Buddha was said to do the same. And some animals, so there are some examples in nature of immaculate or non-sexual conception. So again, those are subjects that kind of go outside the pale of our practicality. I wanted to come to a close with something that I think is very unusual for Yogananda. If you stayed with me this far and haven't fallen asleep or went on to something more interesting, I'll leave this on an interesting note. Let me put it that way. He calls this an exercise for spiritual sex communion, 4 kinds of physical union. So he's talking about sexual union, and he's describing 4 kinds. Well, the first kind, you can guess, that's what's the usual kind, okay? The second level, and these are levels of from lower to higher, that's all I can say, he didn't say, would be sex union for the purpose, with the intention to create a child. The third one is a puzzler. Sex union without physical, I don't know how to say this word, satiety, being satiated. And then he calls that wrong psychology. I just don't know enough about this, but maybe there are some traditions or some people who come together sexually but don't have an orgasm, an ejaculation by the man and an orgasm by the woman. I don't know why they would do that. Is that some sort of religious practice? I really don't know. That's number 3, but he calls it wrong psychology. I think probably because it expresses neither love, nor pleasure, nor having a child. I mean, it's sort of stillborn. It's kind of dead. I can imagine a couple between whom there's no love, perhaps doing that, although I don't know why. But anyway, so that must be something couples do. It's out of my ballpark. And so is number 4, which is the piece de résistance, however you're going to put that. And this is pure Tantra, and it's coming from Paramahansa Yogananda. I'm just going to read it, folks. Sex union, not for physical pleasure. Okay, and that's good. But for withdrawing the sex force to unite it with brain force. To unite sex force with brain force. Uniting sex force and brain force is the same as uniting sex energy with cosmic energy. Transmuting sex force into love. Now those are at least 2, maybe 3 different things. But I'll tell you what I think it is. I mean, besides easily being labeled as a tantric practice, it would be a couple, 2 devotees who maybe they're not, maybe sex is something they still need, I don't know, and they come together. He doesn't mention, not for physical pleasure, so they don't necessarily have an orgasm, I guess, or work with one another to achieve that goal. But what they do is they come together, and then each of them separately takes the energy aroused in that region of the genitals, and perhaps using the breath, draws that energy up into the brain, up and towards divine love, divine devotion. He doesn't say any of that, but what else could he possibly mean and still be Paramahansa Yogananda? And so there it is. And I'm sure it's the only time he ever wrote it. Whether he ever said it in public in a talk, I rather doubt. But there it is. You heard it first. Then he goes on to say, for the unmarried, uniting feeling and knowledge, sex excitement with cosmic energy by spiritual transmutation. This, of course, is really the highest way. When you come together as a partner, it's in this day and age, I just don't see how most people wouldn't do so as essentially an excuse to have sex and call it spiritual, let's face it. But maybe there are some who have enough self-discipline and true devotion. I don't know why you do that. But anyway, when you're, whether single or married, if in any time that that energy is aroused, stimulated in the genital area, let's say by thoughts or something that happens. If you can, through deep breathing, draw the energy up and offer it in devotion. If by exercise, by service to others, by music and arts and humanitarian work and spiritual work and service, can transmute that creative life force without which we would not even live and breathe, then that, of course, is the highest way, through devotion. So he says the tremendous power of the sex force that can produce a new human being gains miraculous strength if it is returned to its original home in the third eye. Well, that was a tough one, folks, but you got it straight. You got it straight from Yogananda through me. I hope I didn't butcher it too much, but anyway, there it is, folks. And tomorrow, I think I come back tomorrow. Padma has some crazy schedule that I don't totally follow, but she says I'm on tomorrow. I don't know what the subject is. Just tune in. You'll find out. It's always interesting, right?